Welcome back to Africa Decoded. Something profound is happening across the African continent, something that feels less like a political moment and more like a continental awakening. From west to east, the winds of change are blowing, but with them comes turbulence, unrest, and an uneasy question about what democracy truly means in Africa today. Over the past few days, the streets of West Africa have erupted once again. Cameroon and Senegal, two nations standing at opposite sides of the same crisis, are witnessing history repeat itself. The people are restless, the air thick with tension, and the chants on the streets echo one word: enough. For decades, these nations have been ruled by leaders who refuse to let go of power. Elections, once seen as symbols of freedom, now feel like rituals, performed every few years to give the illusion of democracy but stripped of real meaning. Citizens go to the polls hoping for change, but instead, they watch the same hands tighten their grip on power, drowning out the voices that dared to hope. And here's the frightening truth: it's not just happening in the West. This pattern of manipulation, suppression, and control has spread across the continent, reaching even the heart of East Africa. In Tanzania, a country once celebrated for peace and stability, something darker is unfolding. A storm is brewing, and at its center stands President Samia Suluhu Hassan, the country's first female leader, once hailed as a symbol of progress, reform, and hope. When she rose to power after the sudden death of President John Magufuli, the world celebrated her as a trailblazer. She represented something rare in African politics: a soft-spoken reformer, promising transparency, unity, and democracy. She lifted bans on opposition rallies, invited exiled leaders home, and restored political freedoms that had long been crushed. For a while, it felt like Tanzania was breathing again. But somewhere along the line, that promise faded. Today, Samia Suluhu Hassan stands accused of the very things she once vowed to fight against: silencing dissent, crushing opposition, and manipulating power. Reports now suggest her government has shut down internet access, arrested critics, and used security forces to intimidate voters. The same nation once praised for stability now echoes with the cries of protesters demanding freedom. It all came to a head on October 29, 2025, a day that was supposed to mark a new chapter for Tanzanian democracy. 37 million citizens were registered to vote. But as the sun rose over Dar es Salaam, the atmosphere was heavy, the streets were eerily silent, and the polling stations were nearly empty. Fear hung over the nation like a shadow. People had seen what happens when you challenge power in Tanzania. They'd witnessed arrests, threats, and disappearances. So, many stayed home, not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid. That silence spoke louder than any ballot ever could. What followed was chaos. Protests broke out across the country as frustrated citizens clashed with police. Tear gas filled the air, rubber bullets scattered crowds, and the military was deployed to restore order. The anger wasn't just about one election, it was about decades of political domination by the ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, which has held power since independence in 1961. For many Tanzanians, this was the last straw. They saw through the illusion, a performance disguised as democracy. To understand how it came to this, we must look at the pattern. Before election day, opposition leaders were silenced or barred from running. Tundu Lissu, the outspoken opposition figure who once survived an assassination attempt, was charged with treason and forbidden from contesting. His party, Chadema, was disqualified after calling out the unfair process. The government denied all wrongdoing, yet opposition figures were detained, harassed, or exiled. By the time voting began, the outcome was already written. 17 candidates appeared on the ballot, but everyone knew there was only one name that truly mattered: Samia Suluhu Hassan. On paper, it looked democratic. In reality, it was a coronation. Across Dar es Salaam, protesters shouted, "We want our country back." As police fired tear gas into the crowd, they demanded electoral reform, transparency, and independence from the ruling party's control. Their courage was met with violence. Fires spread through neighborhoods like Kinondoni and Ubungo. Buses were burned, police stations attacked, and chaos gripped the streets. As night fell, a curfew was declared. But even as the streets went dark, the fight for freedom did not. Then, another silence fell, this time digital. Internet connections vanished, social media went dark, and communication lines collapsed. Tanzania had entered an information blackout. Net blocks confirmed it. A nationwide internet shutdown designed to silence the protests and cut off the world's eyes. It was no longer just a political crisis, it was a full-scale suppression of truth. Opposition leaders denounced the election as a sham. They called it a selection, not an election. Yet the government continued to insist that the process was free, fair, and democratic, even as smoke rose over Dar es Salaam. Outside, the people's cries grew louder. Inside, official statements grew colder. And between those two realities, truth became the first casualty. Analysts say Samia's leadership has started to mirror that of her predecessor. Once a symbol of hope, she's now accused of using fear to maintain control. And it's not just Tanzania. The same pattern is unfolding in Cameroon, where President Paul Biya continues to rule after more than 4 decades in power. There, too, elections serve as theater. The ruling elite controls the institutions, the military enforces silence, and the people are left watching democracy become an illusion. Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Tanzania, it's the same story told in different languages. Leaders manipulate elections, crush dissent, and declare victory. And through it all, the African Union remains silent. The same that swiftly condemned coups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now watches quietly as civilian rulers do the very same thing through corruption and intimidation. So, we have to ask, what's the real difference between a general seizing power with a gun and a politician stealing it with a ballot? Both deny the people their voice. Both destroy the foundations of democracy. The only difference is the costume they wear. In Africa today, elections have become performances, expensive spectacles that mask the truth. Ballots are cast, votes are counted, but the result is already decided. Democracy, once defined as government of the people, by the people, and for the people, has become government over the people, by the few, for themselves. And that's the tragedy. Political analyst Timmy Frank called the recent elections in Tanzania, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast a disgrace to the African continent, selections marred by manipulation, intimidation, and political terrorism. He warned that if this cycle of fraudulent elections continues, Africa risks descending into widespread civil unrest and more coups. He urged the international community to take action, but the truth is, no foreign power can fix this. The restoration of democracy in Africa must come from within, from the people, from accountability, and from leaders willing to stand for truth over control. Because if nothing changes, the next generation of Africans will inherit not freedom, but fear. So, what do you think? Is Africa truly democratic, or are we witnessing democracy in disguise? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to Africa Decoded, where we uncover the truth behind the headlines and decode the powers shaping our continent. Welcome back to Africa Decoded. Across this vast and diverse continent, something powerful, unsettling, and deeply revealing is taking place. It's more than politics. It's more than protest. It's the pulse of a people waking up to the truth about the systems that govern them. From the bustling streets of West Africa to the heart of the East, a wave of awakening is sweeping across nations that have long been trapped in cycles of hope and betrayal. The question that now echoes through cities, villages, and online platforms is simple but explosive: what does democracy truly mean in Africa today? In the past few weeks, the scenes coming out of Cameroon and Senegal have painted a picture of exhaustion and defiance. These are not ordinary protests. They are the cries of a generation that feels cheated by those in power. For years, these nations have been ruled by leaders who seem determined to stay in power indefinitely. Elections that should be celebrations of democracy have become carefully choreographed rituals, performed only to maintain the illusion of freedom. The ballot boxes are still there, the voters still line up, but the outcomes rarely change. Power remains in the same hands, and the voices of millions are silenced beneath the weight of political manipulation. And the unsettling truth: this pattern is spreading across the continent like wildfire. What began as quiet discontent is now erupting into visible rebellion. One of the most striking examples is Tanzania, a country once praised as one of East Africa's most stable and peaceful nations. Today, that same nation finds itself at the center of political chaos and growing unrest. The woman once hailed as a beacon of progress, President Samia Suluhu Hassan, now stands accused of betraying the very ideals she once promised to uphold. When she took power in 2021 after the sudden death of President John Magufuli, the world looked to her as a symbol of hope. She was the first female president in the country's history, a leader who spoke softly but seemed to carry a new vision for the future. In her early months, she lifted political bans, invited exiled opposition figures back home, and spoke of reconciliation. Tanzanians dared to believe change had finally come. But as time passed, the image of reform began to fade, replaced by something eerily familiar. Reports now claim that her administration has tightened its grip on power through censorship, intimidation, and fear. The same leader who once promised freedom now stands accused of shutting down the internet, harassing journalists, and silencing dissenters. Tanzania, once a beacon of stability, is now shrouded in uncertainty. The breaking point came on October 29, 2025, a day that was supposed to symbolize hope and democratic renewal. 37 million people were registered to vote, yet as the sun rose over Dar es Salaam, the atmosphere was heavy with anxiety. The long lines of voters that once defined Tanzanian elections were missing. Streets were quiet, polling centers half-empty. The silence was not apathy, it was fear. Citizens remembered what had happened to those who spoke out before. Arrests, intimidation, and even disappearances had created an invisible wall between the people and their right to choose. That silence on election morning became the loudest protest of all. Then came the chaos. Protests erupted in major cities as citizens took to the streets demanding transparency, fairness, and a genuine electoral process. Tear gas clouds filled the air, stones clashed with shields, and armored vehicles rolled through neighborhoods that once symbolized peace. What started as frustration over an election soon exploded into an all-out cry for freedom. The ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, unchallenged in power since 1961, had turned what should have been an election into an orchestrated performance. The opposition never stood a chance. Tundu Lissu, a well-known opposition figure, was once again targeted, charged with treason, and barred from running. His party, Chadema, was disqualified after it dared to question the integrity of the electoral system. Other opposition leaders faced arrests, harassment, and intimidation. So when ballots were finally counted, no one was surprised by the outcome. On paper, it looked democratic, 17 candidates, multiple parties, but everyone knew only one name mattered, Samia Suluhu Hassan. The election was less a contest and more a coronation. Across Dar es Salaam, protests intensified. People marched through the streets, chanting for change, demanding an independent electoral body, and calling for justice. Fires were lit, buses burned. By evening, the government declared a curfew as the city descended into chaos. Yet, even as the night grew darker, the voices of resistance refused to fade. Then came another kind of silence, digital silence. Internet connections failed across the country. Social media platforms went dark. Messaging apps stopped working. The blackout was deliberate, a move to cut Tanzania off from the world and prevent images of the unrest from spreading. NetBlocks, a global internet observatory, confirmed it was a nationwide shutdown. The digital blackout turned the crisis into something deeper, an attempt to erase truth itself. As the government denied accusations of human rights abuses and insisted the election was fair, the people's trust eroded completely. Opposition leaders called the process a national disgrace, a theatrical display of power disguised as democracy. Their statements went viral before the blackout, describing the election as a selection, not an election. Analysts began drawing parallels between Samia Suluhu's leadership and that of her predecessor. What began as a reformist dream had transformed into another era of fear-driven governance. And as Tanzania burns with frustration, it mirrors a wider pattern across the continent. In Cameroon, Paul Biya continues to rule well into his 90s, his grip on power untouched after more than 4 decades. There too, elections are predictable, the institutions compromised, and the people exhausted. In Ivory Coast, the same cycle plays out, leaders altering constitutions and eliminating rivals to secure endless terms. And through all of this, the African Union, the supposed guardian of democracy, remains silent. The same O that swiftly condemned coups in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso now turns a blind eye to civilian leaders who manipulate ballots and suppress freedom. And that silence speaks louder than any official statement. It raises a haunting question. What truly separates a general who seizes power with a gun from a politician who steals it through rigged elections? Both silence the people. Both destroy hope. Both replace democracy with dictatorship. Only the tools differ. One uses force, the other uses the ballot. Across the continent, democracy has become performance art. Votes are cast, numbers are counted, but the result is already written. The promise of democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, has been distorted into government over the people, by the powerful, for themselves. And that's the greatest tragedy of all. Nigerian political activist Timmy Frank recently described the elections in Tanzania, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast as nothing short of a continental disgrace, elections marred by manipulation, intimidation, and fear. He warned that if the trend continues, Africa risks descending into more coups, more uprisings, and more instability. He called for global intervention, but the hard truth is that no international body can fix what's broken inside. True democracy in Africa must be rebuilt from within, by citizens who refuse to be silenced, by leaders who understand that power is a responsibility, not a birthright, and by institutions strong enough to stand against corruption. Because if nothing changes, the next generation of Africans will inherit not democracy, but dictatorship disguised as one. So, the question remains, are we witnessing democracy's growth or its decay? Is this the awakening Africa needed, or the warning it ignored? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Africa Decoded, where we break through the noise, decode the power, and tell the stories that others won't. Welcome back to Africa Decoded. Across this vast and vibrant continent, something deep, unsettling, and profoundly transformative is taking place. It's more than just a shift in politics, it's an awakening, a realization spreading from the dusty streets of West Africa to the shores of the Indian Ocean. A generation once patient, once hopeful, is now confronting a brutal truth: the promise of democracy in Africa has become a haunting illusion. The winds of change are blowing, but they carry with them not just hope, but anger, exhaustion, and a growing demand for truth. In nations like Cameroon and Senegal, the ground is trembling beneath regimes that have long believed themselves untouchable. These are not ordinary protests, they are the eruptions of decades of frustration, the voices of millions who have watched power remain trapped in the same hands while their futures hang in uncertainty. What was once faith in elections has become cynicism. What was once belief in reform has turned into rebellion. Across these countries, elections are no longer instruments of choice but carefully staged performances, designed to reassure the world that democracy exists while silencing those who question its authenticity. And this phenomenon isn't isolated. It's spreading like wildfire across Africa, reaching even the corners once hailed as stable and peaceful. In East Africa, a country once admired for its unity and calm, Tanzania, now stands at the edge of turmoil. Once celebrated for its progress and peace, it now finds itself trapped in the same web of control, fear, and political deception that has suffocated so many before it. At the heart of this transformation stands President Samia Suluhu Hassan, Tanzania's first female leader and a figure who once embodied hope, compassion, and reform. When she stepped into power after the sudden death of President John Magufuli in 2021, the world looked at her with admiration. She was different, measured, deliberate, and seemingly devoted to healing a nation divided by years of repression. In her early days, she reopened the political space, lifted bans on opposition rallies, allowed exiled leaders to return, and spoke the language of unity and reconciliation. For the first time in years, Tanzanians felt they could breathe. But that breath of freedom was short-lived. Slowly, the tone changed. Criticism grew dangerous again. The government began tightening its grip on the media, limiting access to information, and turning state power against those who dared to question it. What began as a vision of reform evolved into a system of fear. Accusations of censorship, intimidation, and human rights violations began to mount. And then came October 29, 2025, a day that was supposed to mark a turning point for Tanzanian democracy. Instead, it became a symbol of despair. 37 million citizens were registered to vote, yet as dawn broke over Dar es Salaam, the city felt eerily still. Polling stations were nearly empty. The atmosphere was tense, as though the entire country was holding its breath. People were afraid, not of voting, but of the consequences that might follow. For years, they had seen what happens when you oppose the powerful: arrests, threats, and even disappearances. So they stayed home, and that silence was louder than any protest. As the day unfolded, unrest began to boil. In the streets of Mwanza, Arusha, and Dar es Salaam, citizens gathered in defiance, chanting for change and transparency. The response was swift and brutal. Police fired tear gas, soldiers moved in, and chaos filled the air. The sound of rubber bullets echoed through neighborhoods.